The heavy velvet curtains of the parlor at the Grand Dominion Hotel in Philadelphia were drawn tight against the gray afternoon, trapping the stale air inside. It was an atmosphere thick with the smell of expensive cigars, coal dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of brandy. Lydia Beaumont sat on the edge of a high-backed brocade chair, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, feeling the whalebone stays of her corset digging into her ribs. She was 22 years old, draped in emerald silk that cost more than most men earned in a decade. Yet she felt less like a woman and more like a piece of fine china placed carefully on a shelf, waiting to be sold. Across the low mahogany table, two men were deciding the course of her life. One was her father, Silas Beaumont, a man whose face was as hard and unyielding as the granite bedrock he quarried in the north. His beard was gray and trimmed with military precision, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a banker tallying a ledger. The other man was Victor Hale. He was handsome in the way a polished blade is handsome, sharp and gleaming. With slicked-back dark hair and a suit tailored to perfection, he held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, swirling it gently as he spoke of mountains he had never climbed and men he would never meet. "The Union Pacific Spur is finally pushing through the lower pass," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "That opens up the Silver Creek vein to heavy machinery. We can triple extraction by next spring if we secure the capital." Victor nodded, his smile tight and practiced. "The capital is no issue. Silas, my investors in Boston are eager, but they need assurance that the merger of our interests is permanent. They need to know the Beaumont and Hale families are united in blood as well as ink." Lydia turned her head slightly, looking toward the window where a sliver of light escaped the curtains. She could hear the distant, rhythmic chugging of a steam engine leaving the station blocks away. It was a sound that spoke of motion, of distance, of leaving. "And Lydia," Victor said, his voice shifting, becoming smoother, though no warmer. "She understands her role in this, I assume." Silas grunted, tapping ash from his cigar. "Lydia is a dutiful daughter. She knows that this marriage secures her future just as it secures the mine." Lydia felt a cold prickle of humiliation run down her spine. They spoke of her as if she were not in the room, as if she were a plot of land or a share of stock. She turned back to face them, her chin lifting slightly. "I am right here." "Father," she said softly. Victor turned his gaze on her. It was a possessive look, one that evaluated her worth. "Of course you are, my dear, and looking lovely. I was merely telling your father that I have arranged for you to accompany me west, to inspect your new home and the town that will be the crown jewel of our enterprise." Lydia blinked. The west. The images that flooded her mind were not of ledgers or machinery, but of the sketches she had secretly collected from periodicals, etchings of soaring pine cathedrals, jagged peaks touching the heavens, and vast, silent valleys where a person could breathe. It was a romantic, foolish dream, she knew, but it was the only thing that made the prospect of marrying Victor Hale bearable. "Yes," Victor said, setting his glass down. "It is time you saw where the money comes from. It is a rough country, Lydia, but civilized enough for a lady of your standing, provided you stay within the town limits. I would like that," Lydia said. And for the first time that afternoon, her voice held a spark of genuine feeling. "I should like to see the mountains." Victor laughed, a short, dry sound. "You will see plenty of rocks, my dear. Try not to get your skirts too muddy." 2,000 miles away. The wind did not laugh. It screamed. It tore through the high passes of the San Juan Mountains, stripping the warmth from the air and driving ice crystals into the bark of the ancient spruce trees. Here, the world was not made of velvet and mahogany. It was made of iron-hard earth, black timber, and snow that fell with the weight of judgment. Elias Kane moved through the spruce forest like a ghost. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, wearing a coat made from the hide of a grizzly bear he had killed 10 years prior. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with premature gray, covering a face that had been weathered by wind and sun until it looked like cracked leather. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. a white line that disappeared into his beard, a souvenir from a cougar that had thought him an easy meal. He stopped at the base of a deadfall pine, kneeling in the snow. His movements were economical and precise. There was no wasted energy in the high country. Waste meant death. He brushed the powder away from a steel trap, his gloved fingers checking the tension. Empty. Elias stood up, his breath puffing out in white clouds that were snatched away instantly by the gale. He looked up at the sky. It was a bruised purple, heavy with unfallen snow. A storm was coming, a big one. He adjusted the strap of his rifle across his shoulder and turned back toward the ridge. He had not spoken a word in 3 weeks, the last time he had used his voice. It was to tell his mule to stand still while he tightened the cinch. There was no one else to talk to. The nearest human being was a day's ride down the mountain in the mining camp, a place Elias avoided unless he ran out of salt or powder. He preferred the silence. The silence did not lie. It did not make promises it intended to break. Elias reached his cabin as the first flakes began to swirl in the darkening air. It was a sturdy structure, built of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, tucked under the shelter of a limestone overhang that protected it from the worst of the drifts. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside, stomping the snow from his boots. The interior was dim, smelling of pine pitch, cured fir, and wood smoke. It was sparse but meticulously neat. A narrow bunk covered in furs sat in the corner. A cast-iron stove radiated a low, steady heat. On a rough shelf above the table sat his few possessions: a tin cup, a skinning knife, a Bible he could not read but kept anyway, and a small wooden box. Elias hung his coat on a peg and walked to the stove, adding a split log to the fire. He warmed his hands, the scarred knuckles stiff from the cold. Then, as he did every night, he reached for the wooden box. He sat at the table and opened it. Inside lay a silver locket, tarnished black around the edges. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over the smooth metal. He clicked it open. The face inside was small, a tintype portrait fading into sepia oblivion. A woman with laughing eyes and hair pulled back in a ribbon. Sarah. He stared at her face, and the silence of the cabin seemed to deepen, pressing against his eardrums. He turned the locket over, carved on the back, in crude, scratching letters he had paid a traveler to write for him, was a name, Sarah, and below it, baby, 23 years. The number echoed in his mind, spoken in the voice of the wind outside. It had been 23 years since the blizzard in the pass, the wagon wheel that shattered, the long, freezing night where he had held her as the life drained out of her, taking their unborn child with it. 23 years since he had touched a woman with anything other than polite distance. 23 years since he had felt the warmth of a hand in his, or the softness of a cheek. He was 45 years old, but he felt ancient, carved from the same cold stone as the mountain. He snapped the locket shut and placed it back in the box. "Let it snow," he whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy from disuse. "Let it bury the whole damn world." The stagecoach lurched violently, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against granite bedrock. Inside, Lydia grasped the leather strap hanging from the ceiling, her knuckles white. The journey had been nothing like the sketches. For days, they had traveled deeper into the territory, and with every mile, the civilization she knew had been stripped away layer by layer. First the trains had ended, replaced by rough wagons. Then the hotels had vanished, replaced by flea-ridden roadhouses. Now, there was only this, a narrow, terrifying trail winding up the side of a sheer cliff, with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. The air was thin and bit at her lungs, leaving her lightheaded. It smelled of sulfur and wet stone. Opposite her sat a man in a dusty suit who clutched a sample case to his chest, his eyes squeezed shut in prayer. Beside him was a miner with a face like a dried apple, chewing tobacco and spitting out the window, indifferent to the precipice inches from the wheels. Victor had ridden ahead a week ago to prepare the house, leaving Lydia to follow with the luggage and the regular stage. She wished he were here now, if only so she could grip his arm and scream at him for bringing her to this godforsaken place. The coach hit a rut, and Lydia was thrown against the wooden wall. She gasped, straightening her hat. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice trembling. The miner opened one eye. "Top of the pass is another hour. Ma'am, town is 2 hours past that. If we don't slide off first." Lydia shuddered. The driver, a man named Jeb with a voice like gravel, had warned them at the last station. "Pass is treacherous this time of year," he had said. "Ground is thawing and freezing, unstable, and there are men in these hills who would slit your throat for a bootlace." She looked out the window. Below, at the bottom of the ravine, she saw the shattered skeleton of a wagon, its wooden ribs bleaching in the cold sun. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawled over her skin. This land did not care about the Beaumont money. It did not care about Victor's contracts. It was huge, indifferent, and hungry. The wind began to pick up, howling through the canyons. Snow pellets tapped against the glass like restless fingers. "Whoa!" Jeb shouted from the box above. "Whoa! Damn you!" The coach slowed. Lydia leaned forward. "What is it?" Before the miner could answer, a sound began. It started as a low rumble, deep in the earth, a vibration she felt in her teeth. Then it grew, swelling into a roar that drowned out the wind. "Look out!" the drummer screamed, opening his eyes wide. Lydia turned to the window on the uphill side. High above, the mountain seemed to be moving. A sheet of white and gray was detaching itself from the peak. Boulders the size of carriages were bounding down the slope, smashing trees into matchsticks, riding a wave of churning snow and earth. The driver cracked his whip, screaming at the horses. But it was too late. The first boulder slammed into the lead horses. A terrible, high-pitched scream of animal agony tore through the air. The coach pitched forward violently as the team went down. Lydia was thrown from her seat. She hit the ceiling, then the floor. Then the world turned upside down. The coach was struck broadside by the slide. Wood splintered with the sound of gunshots. The carriage rolled, tumbling over the edge of the road. Lydia felt a crushing impact against her shoulder. Then her head struck something hard. Darkness swallowed her before she even finished screaming. Cold. That was the first thing she knew. A cold so absolute it felt like burning. Lydia opened her eyes. The world was white and gray. She was lying on her side, half buried in snow. Above her, the shattered remains of the stagecoach lay wedged against a stand of pine trees. The carriage had broken apart, spilling trunks and passengers down the steep slope. She tried to move, and a cry of pain escaped her lips. Her left arm throbbed with a dull, sickening ache, and her face felt wet. She reached up with her good hand and touched her forehead. Her fingers came away red. "Victor?" she whispered, confused. "Father?" Then memory crashed back into her. The slide, the fall. She pushed herself up, gasping as the thin air burned her chest. She looked around. "Driver!" she called out, her voice thin and weak against the wind. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered her, save for the rising moan of the storm. She crawled toward the wreckage. The miner was lying near a twisted wheel, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. He was gone. She scrambled backward, choking back bile. She looked for the drummer. She saw his sample case open, bottles of patent medicine scattered across the snow like jewels. But the man himself was nowhere to be seen. Buried, perhaps, or thrown further down the ravine. And the driver, Jeb. She saw a boot sticking out from under the crushed box of the coach. She was alone. Lydia stood up, swaying. The wind caught her skirts, whipping the heavy fabric around her legs. She was wearing a traveling suit of fine wool, but it was no match for a mountain blizzard. The cold was already gnawing through her layers, seeking her skin. She had to move. If she stayed here, she would die. "Help!" she screamed, turning in a circle. "Please!" The snow was falling harder now, a curtain of white dropping over the world. She couldn't see the road above. She couldn't see the bottom of the ravine. There was only the white. Closing in, she began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find shelter. She stumbled through the drifts, her boots sinking deep. Every step was a battle. Branches whipped her face, scratching her cheeks. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost its meaning. The light began to fade, the gray sky turning to charcoal. Lydia's feet were numb. She couldn't feel her fingers inside her gloves. Her thoughts were becoming sluggish, thick like syrup. She imagined she was back in the hotel parlor. It was warm there. If she just sat down for a moment, she could rest. No, a voice in her head whispered. If you sit, you sleep. If you sleep, you never wake up. But the snow was so soft, it looked like the down pillows on her bed at home. She tripped over a buried root and fell hard. This time, she didn't have the strength to get up. She lay there, the ice pressing against her cheek. It wasn't cold anymore. It felt almost pleasant. She closed her eyes. I'm sorry, Papa, she thought. I tried. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, she heard a sound. Not the wind, a crunch, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of footsteps breaking through the crust. She forced her heavy eyelids open. A shadow loomed over her. It was huge, blotting out the sky. A monster of the mountains, covered in fur, with ice trapped in its dark beard. It held a rifle in one massive hand. Lydia tried to scream, but only a whimper came out. The monster knelt. A hand, rough and smelling of leather, touched her face. Alive, a deep voice grumbled. It sounded like stones grinding together. Elias Kane stared down at the bundle of rags in the snow. He had been checking the perimeter of his trap line before the storm fully hit when he saw the slide tracks. He hadn't expected to find survivors. He certainly hadn't expected to find a woman. She was delicate, her skin pale as milk where the blood wasn't drying on it. Her clothes were absurd, fine wool and lace, completely useless for this country. She looked like a doll dropped by a careless child. He hesitated. For 23 years, his world had been defined by what he did not let in. He did not let in complications. He did not let in softness. He did not let in the past. But looking at her, half buried in the drift, her breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs, he knew he had no choice. God help me, Elias muttered. He slung his rifle across his back. He reached down, sliding his arms under her. She was light, terrifyingly fragile. He lifted her against his chest. The contact was a shock, even through the layers of his bare coat and her wool suit. The weight of a woman in his arms hit him with the force of a physical blow. It brought a sudden, blinding flash of memory. Sarah, laughing as he carried her across a creek. Sarah, limp in his arms as he dug through the snow. His heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. Panic flared in his gut. He wanted to drop her and run. He wanted to retreat into his cabin and bar the door. But the woman moaned, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her hand, small and gloved, twitched against his coat. Elias set his jaw. He shoved the memories down into the dark place where he kept them. He adjusted his grip, pulling her closer to shield her from the wind. Hold on, he told her, though he knew she couldn't hear him. He turned his back to the wind and began the climb. The storm was screaming now, a whiteout that erased the trees and the sky. But Elias knew these woods. He knew every root and stone. He lowered his head and marched into the white, the woman's heartbeat fluttering against his own. Carrying her upward toward the only light for 20 miles, the first thing Lydia noticed was the smell. It was not the lavender and pressed linen scent of the hotel in Philadelphia, nor the stale tobacco of the stagecoach. It was a thick, earthen scent, pine pitch, wood smoke, curing leather, and the musk of unwashed wool. She opened her eyes, but the world swam in a haze of amber light and deep shadow. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that seemed to beat in time with the howling wind outside. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, as if her limbs had been replaced with lead. She was lying on a narrow, wooden platform covered in scratchy, coarse blankets and the heavy fur of some great beast. "Where?" she rasped, her throat dry as dust. She pushed herself up on one elbow, blinking against the dimness. The room was small, a box of rough-hewn logs chinked with moss. Shadows danced on the walls, thrown by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp sitting on a plank table. By the hearth, a man sat on a three-legged stool. He was the monster from her fading memory, the giant who had loomed over her in the snow. He was hunched over a boot, driving an awl through the leather with steady, powerful movements. His profile was sharp and severe, dominated by a thick beard that hid half his face and a nose that looked like it had been broken more than once. Lydia gasped, clutching the rough blanket to her throat. The sound made the man stop. He did not jump or startle, he simply ceased his movement, the awl poised in midair, and turned his head slowly to look at her. "You are awake," he said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating in the small space like a distant rock slide. Lydia scrambled backward until her back hit the log wall. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through her confusion. "Who are you? What is this place? Where is the coach?" The man set the boot down and stood up. In the low cabin, he seemed to fill the entire space, his head nearly brushing the drying herbs that hung from the rafters. "My name is Elias Kane," he said. "You are in my cabin." "Where is the coach?" Lydia repeated, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that shamed her, though she could not control it. "I demand to know where the others are. The driver, Mr. Henderson, dead," Elias said flatly. "Or gone. The mountain took the road." Lydia stared at him, her chest heaving. Dead? That was not possible. They were just traveling. They were on a schedule. Victor was waiting. "You are lying," she whispered. "You have kidnapped me. My father is Silas Beaumont. He will pay you whatever you want, but you must take me to the town immediately. Right now." Elias looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the shadow of his brow. He did not look like a man who cared about Silas Beaumont or his money. He looked tired. "You want to go to town?" he asked. "Yes," Lydia cried, throwing the blankets aside. She realized with a jolt of horror that she was not wearing her corset or her petticoats, but only her thin chemise and drawers. Her fine wool traveling suit was hanging near the fire, steaming. Shame flushed her skin hot, but she swung her legs over the side of the bunk anyway. "I am leaving." Elias did not move to stop her. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward the heavy timber door. "Go ahead," he said. Lydia slid off the bunk. Her legs wobbled, weak as a newborn colt's, and the floorboards were freezing beneath her bare feet. She grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders like a shawl, and marched toward the door. He was bluffing. He had to be. She would walk out that door, find the road, and hail a carriage. She lifted the heavy iron latch and shoved the door open. The world exploded inward. It was not just wind, it was a physical blow. A wall of white fury that slammed into her with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. The roar was deafening. 1,000 screaming banshees tearing at the roof. Snow did not fall. It drove sideways, hard as birdshot, stinging her face and eyes. Lydia squinted, trying to see the road, the trees, anything. There was nothing. Beyond the threshold, the world had ceased to exist. There was only a swirling, chaotic void of white. The snow was piled 4 feet high against the cabin wall, and beyond that, the ground seemed to drop away into an abyss of howling gray. She stood frozen, the cold instantly biting through the thin linen of her shift, turning her blood to ice. The sheer violence of the storm was unlike anything she had ever imagined in her parlor sketches. This was not a romantic winter scene. This was death. A large hand reached past her, grabbing the edge of the door. Elias pulled it shut, forcing it against the wind until the latch clicked home. The sudden silence ringing in the cabin was heavy. Lydia stood shivering, her teeth beginning to chatter violently. She stared at the wood grain of the door, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had seen. "Can't go down," Elias said, his voice quiet behind her. "Not in this, not for days, maybe a week." Lydia turned slowly. Her anger had evaporated, replaced by a cold, crawling dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. She looked at the rough logs, the single bunk, the dark corners, and finally at the man standing before her, a stranger with scarred hands, and eyes that held no warmth. "I am trapped," she whispered. Elias walked back to the fire and picked up his boot. "You are alive," he corrected her. The first 3 days were a test of endurance that Lydia felt she was failing. The cabin was a prison. It was scarcely 20 feet by 15, a confined space that forced an intimacy she found repellent. There was no privacy. There was no silence. She hated the dirt. It was everywhere. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light. Ash from the stove settled on the floor, and the smell of unwashed bodies, his and now hers, seemed to permeate the air. She hated the way her hair, unpinned and tangled, fell in her face. She hated that her expensive dress, now dry, was stiff with mud and torn at the hem. But mostly, she hated him. She hated his silence. She hated the way he moved around the cabin with an economy of motion that made her feel clumsy and useless. She hated that she was dependent on him for every scrap of food, every log on the fire, every cup of water. Elias, for his part, seemed to view her as an unwanted animal he had been forced to take in, a nuisance that disrupted the solitary rhythm of his life. He slept on the floor. On the first night, he had taken a buffalo robe and rolled it out on the hearthstones, leaving the bunk to her. He did not offer it with gallantry. He simply threw the robe down and turned his back to her. "Do not step on me in the night," he had growled. Lydia lay in the bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind batter the roof. She could hear him breathing. It was a slow, deep sound, steady and grating. She wept quietly into the rough wool of the pillow, tears of frustration and fear leaking from her eyes. "Stop it!" Elias's voice cut through the dark. Lydia stiffened, choking back a sob. "I am not doing anything. You are crying," he said. "It is loud. I have nearly died." Lydia snapped, her voice trembling. "I am lost in a wilderness with a stranger. I believe I am entitled to cry." "Save your water," he muttered, rolling over so his shoulder was a wall against her. "Tears won't melt the snow." His callousness stung worse than the cold. He was a brute, she decided, a man carved from rock, with no heart to speak of. But as the days bled into one another, Lydia began to notice things. She noticed that when she had to use the chamber pot in the corner, a humiliation that made her wish for death, Elias would loudly busy himself with the stove, clanging iron lids and coughing, creating a din to cover any sound she might make. She noticed that he always ate after she did, taking the smaller portion of the salt pork and beans, and she noticed the way he avoided looking at her. It was not the avoidance of indifference. It was active. If she walked past him, he stared at the wall. If she adjusted her bodice, he suddenly found great interest in the grain of the table. He moved around her like she was made of red-hot iron, something dangerous to be near. On the 4th morning, the storm broke long enough for the sun to pierce the gray veil. The light was blinding, reflecting off the diamond-dust snow. Elias stood by the door, pulling on his heavy coat. "Water bucket is empty," he said, pointing to a wooden pail near the stove. "Creek is 50 yards back of the cabin. Need to break the ice." Lydia looked up from the table where she sat nursing a tin cup of weak coffee. "You expect me to go out there? I expect you to drink," Elias said. "I have traps to check, unless you want to starve." "I have to go." "You get the water." He opened the door and vanished into the glare before she could argue. Lydia stared at the door, fuming. She looked at her hands, soft, pale hands that had never held anything heavier than an embroidery hoop or a book of poetry. Victor had once told her that her hands were made for diamonds. Now, they were chapped and red. She stood up, fueled by a sudden, hot spark of indignation. She would not be useless. She would not let this mountain man look at her with that pitying contempt. She grabbed the heavy woolen shawl he had lent her and wrapped it tight. She shoved her feet into her ruined boots and picked up the pail. It was heavier than it looked. Outside, the cold hit her like a slap. The air was so clean it hurt to breathe. The world was a blinding expanse of white. The trees bowed heavy under the snow. She saw Elias's tracks leading off into the woods, deep post holes in the drifts. She turned the other way, toward the sound of trickling water. The path to the creek was steep and slick with ice. Lydia slipped twice, catching herself on tree branches, the rough bark tearing at her gloves. When she reached the creek, it was frozen over, save for a small hole Ellis must have chopped earlier. She knelt in the snow, her skirts soaking up the moisture. The water in the hole was black and menacing. She lowered the bucket. The current tugged at it, surprisingly strong. The weight of the water nearly pulled her in. She gasped, digging her heels into the snow, hauling with both arms. The handle bit into her palms. She heaved the bucket onto the bank, water sloshing over her boots. It was freezing. Her toes screamed in protest. Lydia stood up, gripping the handle with both hands. She took a step. The bucket swung, hitting her shin. She stumbled, water splashing down her skirt. "Damn it," she hissed, a word she had never used in her life. She gritted her teeth. She thought of Victor and his smug smile. She thought of her father and his ledgers. She thought of Elias and his back turned to her. "I will not drop it," she muttered. It took her 20 minutes to walk the 50 yards. Her shoulders burned. Her fingers were locked into claws around the handle. But she did not stop. She focused on the door of the cabin, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3. When she finally kicked the door open and stumbled inside, she was panting, sweat freezing on her forehead. Elias was already there. He had returned through the back way, a brace of snowshoe hairs hanging from his belt. He looked up as she entered, watching her heave the bucket onto the table. Water sloshed over the rim, puddling on the wood. Lydia stood straight, her chest heaving, wiping a strand of hair from her face. She glared at him, daring him to criticize the spilled water. Elias looked at the bucket. Then he looked at her. For the first time, his eyes did not slide away. He looked her full in the face, and she saw a flicker of something that wasn't annoyance. It was respect. "Fire needs wood," was all he said, but he poured her a cup of the fresh water first. The evenings were the hardest. When the sun went down, the cabin seemed to shrink. The wind picked up again, a constant, mournful presence. They were forced into proximity by the circle of heat from the stove. Lydia sat on the bunk, mending a tear in her skirt with a bone needle Elias had given her. Elias sat by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Lydia's eyes wandered around the room. She was bored, her mind starving for distraction. Her gaze landed on the shelf above the table, the one place she had not dared to inspect. There, tucked behind a tin of gunpowder, was a small object. Curiosity overcame her caution. She stood up and walked to the shelf. Elias stopped whittling, his knife still. Lydia reached up. It was a wooden horse. It was carved with exquisite care. The legs were delicate, the mane rendered in tiny, flowing cuts. It was smooth from handling, the wood dark with the oil from skin. Beside it sat the silver locket she had seen him holding that first night. She turned the horse over in her hands. It was a child's toy, a masterwork of love. "Who did this belong to?" she asked softly. The sound of the knife hitting the table was like a gunshot. "Put it back," Elias said. His voice was low, dangerous. Lydia froze. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the fire. His jaw set so hard the muscle jumped beneath his beard. "I only asked," Lydia said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is beautiful." "It is not yours," Elias said. He stood up, and the violence in the movement made her flinch. He walked to the shelf, took the horse from her hand, and placed it back in the shadows. His movements were jerky, agitated. "There was a wife," he said, the words dragged out of him. "Sarah, and a child. What happened to them?" Lydia asked, though she knew she should stop. "The mountains took them," Elias said. "That is all." He turned away, grabbing his coat from the peg. "Where are you going?" Lydia asked. "It is storming. I need wood." He lied. There was a full stack by the door. He slammed the door behind him, leaving Lydia alone with the ghost of the wooden horse and the silence that felt suddenly crowded with grief. That night, the wind was a living thing, clawing at the mortar between the logs. Lydia slept fitfully. her dreams filled with falling rocks and Victor's laughter. She woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a gasp, a desperate, choking sound. She sat up in the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the floor. Elias was thrashing. He was tangled in the buffalo robe, his head tossing from side to side. His hands were clawing at the air, as if fighting off an invisible attacker. "Sarah!" he choked out. The name was a ragged plea. "No! Hold on! Sarah!" He sounded terrified. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. Lydia did not think. She did not remember his coldness or his gruff orders. She only heard a human being in pain. She slipped out of the bunk and crossed the cold floor. She knelt beside his bedroll. "Elias," she whispered. "Elias, wake up." He did not hear her. He was deep in the snow of 23 years ago. He was groaning, a low, animal sound of despair. "Sarah, don't let go." Lydia reached out. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Elias!" The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Elias flinched as if she had branded him with a hot iron. His whole body jerked, a spasm of shock. He scrambled backward, crashing into the stone hearth, his eyes flying open. He was panting, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and wild, seeing things that weren't there. He looked at Lydia, her white shift glowing in the ember light, her hand still outstretched, and for a second, he looked terrified of her. "Don't," he rasped, holding up a hand. "Don't touch me." Lydia pulled her hand back, clutching it to her chest. You were dreaming. You were shouting. I only wanted to wake you." Elias stared at her. Slowly, the madness faded from his eyes, replaced by a crushing shame. He slumped against the stones, burying his face in his hands. "I am sorry," he mumbled. His voice was hoarse, broken. "I'm sorry." Lydia sat back on her heels, shivering. The floor was freezing, but she did not move. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why did you jump like that?" Elias lowered his hands. He looked at the fire, refusing to meet her gaze. "Because," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "it has been 23 years." Lydia waited. 23 years since I felt a hand on me. Elias said, "Since the winter they died, since I held her and felt her go cold, I came up here to get away from the world, to disappear in the silence." He looked at his hands, turning them over, scarred, calloused, empty. "I haven't touched a woman, or been touched by one. In all that time, my body, it forgot. It forgot what it feels like to be comforted. It only remembers the pain." Lydia looked at him. She saw the man beneath the mountain man. She saw the vast, gaping wound of loneliness that he had tried to pack with snow and silence. And suddenly, her own life, so full of people and parties and noise, felt incredibly empty. "I know loneliness," she said quietly. Elias looked at her, his brow furrowing. You? You are a rich man's daughter. You have a fiancé. You have a world of people. I have an audience." Lydia said, "Not people." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "My father looks at me and sees a merger," she said, the bitterness surprising her. "Victor looks at me and sees a trophy, a decoration for his dinner table, even in a ballroom with 100 people. No one is actually speaking to me. They are speaking to the Beaumont name. They are speaking to the money." She looked at Elias. "I am 22 years old. Elias, and until I came to this cabin, I do not think anyone has ever looked at me and seen a human being, just a marriage piece, a useful asset." Elias studied her. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the sadness in her eyes. He saw the strength in her jaw, the same strength that had carried that water bucket. "We are a pair, then," he murmured. "Two ghosts haunting different worlds." Lydia managed a small, sad smile. "I suppose we are." She shivered violently as a draft swept across the floor. "You should go back to the bunk," Elias said, his voice rougher now, but lacking the earlier bite. "You will freeze." Lydia stood up. She hesitated. "Good night, Elias." He nodded, turning back to the dying fire. "Good night, Lydia." It was the first time he had used her name. The storm raged for another week, But the air inside the cabin had changed. The tension remained, but it was no longer the sharp, jagged tension of enemies. It was the hum of two people learning to exist in the same space. The truce began with small things. On the 6th day, Elias sat by the fire, struggling to thread a needle with his thick, scarred fingers. He was trying to mend a tear in his flannel shirt, swearing softly under his breath. Lydia watched him from the table. She stood up, walked over, and gently took the needle from his hand. "Let me," she said. Elias watched as she threaded it in a single, fluid motion. She sat on the stool and began to stitch the tear. Her stitches were tiny, even, and perfect. "You have good hands," Elias grunted. Lydia smiled, not looking up. "I had to learn something useful in between French lessons and piano." The next day, Elias brought in a bundle of wire and sticks. "If you are going to eat, you should know where it comes from," he said. He taught her how to set a snare for a rabbit. He showed her how to read the signs in the snow, the tracks, the droppings, the runs. He showed her how to split kindling without taking off a finger, guiding her hands on the hatchet handle. She smelled of wood smoke now, not lavender. Her hair was braided back simply. Her hands were rough. And strangely, she felt more alive than she ever had in Philadelphia. But with the truce came something else, a new kind of tension. It was in the way Elias watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was in the way Lydia felt her pulse jump when he brushed past her to reach the stove. The cabin was too small for two people who were no longer strangers. One night, Lydia climbed the ladder to the small loft where Elias stored dried venison and flour. She was retrieving a sack of meal for dinner. The ladder was steep, simply rungs nailed into the wall. As she descended, clutching the heavy sack, her boot slipped on a polished rung. She gasped, falling backward. Elias moved with the speed of a striking snake. He caught her before she hit the floor. His arms went around her waist, stopping her fall, pulling her hard against his chest to steady her. The impact knocked the breath from her. She dropped the sack of meal. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Lydia was pressed against him, her feet dangling inches from the floor. She could feel the hard muscle of his chest through his shirt. She could feel the heat of him, radiating like a furnace. His hands were large and strong on her waist, gripping her firmly. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. She saw the gray in his beard. She saw the scar on his temple. She saw his eyes, dark, dilated, and burning with a sudden, terrified hunger. She could smell him, pine and sweat and man. It was an intoxicating, overwhelming scent. Her breath hitched in her throat. She felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She wanted to lean in. She wanted to close that tiny distance. Elias stared at her. He could feel her heart beating against his ribs. He could feel the softness of her body against the hardness of his own. The memory of 23 years of ice began to crack. The desire was a physical pain, a roar in his blood that drowned out the wind. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to carry her to the bunk and bury himself in her warmth, and forget the snow and the graves and the years. His hands tightened on her waist, just for a second. Then he went rigid. The fear returned, the fear of needing, the fear of losing. He set her down abruptly, almost pushing her away. "Careful," he said, his voice strangled. He stepped back, putting the table between them. He refused to look at her. I need to check the mules," he said. "Elias," Lydia whispered, her skin burning where he had touched her. He did not answer. He grabbed his coat and fled into the freezing night, slamming the door behind him, desperate to cool the storm that was rising inside him, a storm far more dangerous than the one raging outside. The silence woke her. For a week, the wind had been a constant companion, a screaming, physical weight pressing against the logs of the cabin. Now, there was only the pop of cooling ash in the stove and the rhythmic sound of Elias breathing in the darkness near the hearth. Lydia lay still under the heavy furs, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The storm had broken. She felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the ache of an ending. The door creaked open, admitting a slice of blinding, crystalline light. Elias stepped in, stomping snow from his boots. He carried an armload of wood. His face red from the biting air, he looked at her, and for a moment, the guardedness that had defined his face for the first few days was gone, replaced by a somber resignation. "Sky is clear," he said, dumping the wood by the stove. "It is a hard blue. The snow will hold for a few hours before the sun softens the crust." Lydia sat up, clutching the blanket. "What are you saying?" Elias knelt to feed the fire, not looking at her. "I am saying it is time. If we don't go now, the mountain might change its mind. Another storm could roll in by tomorrow. We have a window." Lydia looked around the small, dim cabin. She looked at the rough table where they had shared meager meals, the single spoon they had taken turns using, the shelf with the wooden horse. A week ago, this place had been a terrified prison. Now, the thought of leaving it felt like stepping out of a warm bed into a freezing river. "To the town?" she asked. "To the town," Elias confirmed. "Back to your people." He stood up and began gathering supplies, strips of dried meat, a coil of rope, his rifle. His movements were efficient, stripping the cabin of the temporary life they had built. Lydia dressed in silence. Her fine wool suit was ruined, stained with soot and grease, the hem ragged. It offered little protection against the deep freeze outside. Elias turned to her, holding a bundle of fur. "You can't walk in that lace," he said gruffly. "Put this on." It was his spare coat, an old, heavy thing made of buffalo hide, smelling of smoke and animal musk. He held out a hat made of fox fur and a pair of thick woolen socks. Lydia pulled the socks over her fine leather boots, then slid her arms into the massive coat. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the hem dragging on the floor. It was heavy, crushing her shoulders, but the warmth was immediate. She looked at him. "I must look ridiculous." Elias studied her. His eyes lingered on her face, framed by the rough fur. "You look warm," he said. "That is all that matters." The world outside was blinding. Lydia had to shield her eyes against the glare. The mountains were no longer gray and angry. They were a pristine, terrifying white. The sun hammered down from a sky the color of shattered glass, making the snowfields glitter like millions of diamonds. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that felt indifferent to human life. "We walk single file," Elias instructed, tying his snowshoes to his pack. He would not use them, choosing to break trail with his boots so she could step in his footprints. "Stay close. If you feel yourself slipping, do not grab the air. Drop your center." They set out. The snow was crusted hard on top, but every few steps, Lydia's weight would break through, plunging her leg deep into the powder. It was exhausting work. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that burned her throat. Elias moved with a steady, relentless rhythm. He was a part of this landscape, moving through it rather than against it. Every 100 yards, he would stop and turn, waiting for her to catch up, his eyes scanning the ridges for signs of slides or predators. Lydia struggled. The coat was heavy and her legs burned. But every time she stumbled, Elias was there. He did not coddle her, but his hand would shoot out, gripping her elbow or her pack, steadying her with a strength that felt like an anchor. "You are doing fine," he said after she fell face first into a drift for the third time. "I am clumsy," she gasped, wiping snow from her eyelashes. "I am a burden." Elias pulled her upright. "You are alive. Dead weight is a burden. You are moving." They walked for hours. The sun rose higher, and the air warmed slightly, making the snow heavy and wet. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the distant caw of a raven. By noon, they reached a section of the trail that terrified Lydia just looking at it. It was a narrow ledge cut into the side of a granite cliff. To their left was a solid wall of rock. To their right was a sheer drop of 300 feet into a ravine filled with jagged boulders and ice. The ledge was covered in a sloping sheet of snow. "Step exactly where I step," Elias said, his voice hard. "Do not look down. Look at my back." He started across, kicking his boots into the snow to create footholds. Lydia followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She fixed her eyes on the worn leather of his coat, counting his steps. 1, 2, 3. The wind picked up, swirling snow around her boots. She felt the emptiness to her right, a vast, hungry pull. Halfway across, the toe of her boot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. It happened in a heartbeat. Her foot shot out. She lost her balance, her arms windmilling. "Elias!" she screamed. She fell, sliding on her stomach toward the edge. The heavy buffalo coat, so warm a moment ago, was now slick against the snow, speeding her descent. She clawed at the ground, but her gloved fingers found no purchase. She saw the edge coming. She saw the tops of the pine trees far below. Suddenly, a weight slammed onto her back. Elias had thrown himself flat, driving his body into the snow. His hand clamped around her wrist with the force of a bear trap. Lydia gasped, swinging over the abyss. Her legs dangled in empty air. She looked up, terrified, to see Elias lying on the very edge of the ledge, his teeth bared in a grimace of exertion, his boots hooked onto a small outcropping of rock. "Got you," he grunted. He hauled her up. It was not a graceful rescue. He dragged her through the snow until she was safe against the cliff wall, away from the edge. They lay there for a long moment, tangled together in the snow, both breathing hard. Lydia was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline crashing through her system. Elias pushed himself up, his face pale beneath his beard. He looked at her, checking for injuries, his hands patting her shoulders, her arms. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "No," she whispered. I slipped." Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. He slumped back against the rock, closing his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the raw fear she saw there took her breath away. It wasn't fear for himself. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice rough. Lydia looked at him, this rough, scarred man who had lived in silence for 23 years. She saw the terror in his eyes, and beneath it, a fierce, protective tenderness that broke her heart. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his cheek. His skin was cold, his beard rough against her palm. "You didn't," she said softly. "You have me." He leaned into her touch for a fraction of a second, a moment of weakness he couldn't stop. Then, the mask slammed back down. He pulled away, standing up and brushing the snow from his legs. "We have to keep moving," he said, turning his back to her to hide his face. "The sun is getting low." The descent from the high country was a journey through time. They left the pristine, silent winter of the peaks and descended into the muddy, ugly reality of spring in the valley. As the elevation dropped, the snow turned to slush, then to mud. The trees, which had been majestic sentinels of spruce and fir, gave way to stumps, thousands of them, cut close to the ground, leaving the hillsides looking like a graveyard of wooden bones. Then came the smell. It hit Lydia before she saw the town. It was a thick, acrid stench of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and raw sewage. It choked the clean mountain air, leaving a greasy film on her tongue. "Civilization," Elias muttered, looking down at the valley floor. The town, Silver Creek, was a scar on the land. It was a collection of hastily built wooden shacks, canvas tents, and false-fronted buildings huddled together in the mud. Wagon ruts cut deep gashes through the main street. The sound of machinery, the stamps crushing ore, the steam whistles echoed off the canyon walls. Lydia stopped, staring down at it, from her father's descriptions in Philadelphia. She had imagined a bustling, industrious center of progress. What she saw was a festering wound. "This is where I am to live?" she asked, her voice small. "It is where the money is," Elias said. They walked down the final switchback. Lydia felt a growing sense of dread. With every step toward the town, the freedom of the cabin felt further away. She pulled Elias's coat tighter around her, as if it could shield her from what was coming. They reached the outskirts of town just as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting the valley into long, gray shadows. Men were coming off shift from the mines, their faces blackened with dust, their eyes hollow. They stopped to stare at the strange pair, the giant mountain man and the woman drowning in a buffalo coat. Suddenly, a shout rang out. "Hey, you there!" A group of riders was coming up the road. At the lead was a man on a tall black stallion. He wore a heavy wool coat with a fur collar and a silver-handled pistol on his hip. It was Victor Hale. He was flanked by 3 other men, hard-looking men with shotguns across their saddles. They were not miners. They were hired guns, the kind of men who sold their violence to the highest bidder. Victor pulled his horse up sharply, mud splattering from the hooves. He peered through the gloom, his eyes narrowing. "Lydia?" Lydia stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Victor." For a moment, there was silence. Victor stared at her. He looked at the buffalo coat, the fox hat, the mud on her face. He looked at Elias standing beside her, rifle in the crook of his arm. "My God," Victor said. He swung down from his saddle, rushing toward her. "We thought you were dead." "The coach. We found the wreckage 3 days ago. Everyone was dead." He reached her, grabbing her shoulders. He pulled her into an embrace, but it felt stiff, performative. He smelled of bay rum and expensive tobacco, a scent that suddenly made Lydia nauseous. "I am alive," Lydia said, pulling back slightly. Victor held her at arm's length, his eyes scanning her face. He looked relieved. Yes, but beneath it, Lydia saw a flash of something else, calculation. He was checking her for damage. He was wondering if his asset was still valuable. Then, his gaze flicked to Elias. The look changed instantly. It became cold, dismissive, and deeply suspicious. It was the way a man looked at a stray dog he intended to kick. "And who is this?" Victor asked, his voice sharp. "He found me," Lydia said quickly, sensing the tension. "I was freezing in the snow. He carried me to his cabin. He saved my life. Victor—" Victor's eyes narrowed further. "His cabin?" He looked Elias up and down, sneering at the rough buckskins, the worn rifle, the scar. "You were with him?" Victor asked, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Alone? For a week?" Lydia felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. It was not shame, but anger. "I was surviving. Victor." The men on the horses exchanged glances. One of them, a man with a broken nose, chuckled darkly. "A week in a cabin," he muttered to his companion. "That's a long time to keep warm." Elias stiffened. His hand tightened on his rifle stock. He took a step forward, his dark eyes locking onto the man who had spoken. "You have something to say?" Elias asked. His voice was a low growl, far more dangerous than the guns on their saddles. The man stopped laughing. He shifted uncomfortably, looking away. Lydia stepped between them. "Elias, please." Victor cleared his throat, regaining his composure. He plastered a thin, tight smile on his face. He put a hand on Lydia's shoulder, his fingers digging in possessively. "Well," he said loudly, addressing the growing crowd of miners and townspeople who had gathered, "we are grateful, of course. You have done a service to the company. Sir." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather coin purse. He held it out to Elias. "For your trouble," Victor said. It was an insult. It was payment for a service rendered, dismissing the humanity of what had happened. It reduced saving a life to a transaction. Elias looked at the purse. Then he looked at Victor's face. "I didn't do it for your money," Elias said quietly. He did not take the purse. Victor's smile faltered, his eyes hardening. He withdrew his hand slowly. "Suit yourself," he said, "but I suggest you head back up to your hills. Friend, this is a respectable town. We don't have much use for hermits and drifters here." Lydia gasped. "Victor, you cannot speak to him that way." Victor squeezed her shoulder. "Hard enough to hurt. You are tired, my dear. You are hysterical. Let's get you inside." He began to steer her toward the largest building on the street, the company hotel. Lydia looked back. Elias was standing in the mud, alone. The crowd parted around him like water around a stone. He looked small suddenly, dwarfed by the noise and the machinery and the judgment of the town. She tried to stop, but Victor pushed her forward. The walk to the hotel was a gauntlet. News traveled fast in a mining camp. By the time they reached the boardwalk of the general store, A group of women had gathered. These were the wives of the engineers and the merchants, the self-appointed guardians of morality in a lawless place. They stood on the porch, their skirts pulled tight, their bonnets stiff. As Lydia passed, bundled in the filthy man's coat, they stopped talking. Their silence was louder than a scream. Lydia felt their eyes crawling over her. She saw the way they looked at Elias, then at her, then back at Elias. She saw the judgment in their pinched mouths. Alone. No chaperone. In a cabin with a savage. Ruined. The words were not spoken, but they hung in the air like smoke. Lydia felt a wave of nausea. In the mountains, she had been a survivor. She had hauled water and set snares. She had been strong. Here, she was just a scandal. She heard a whisper as she passed. "Poor thing. Damaged goods now." Lydia stumbled. Victor gripped her arm, practically dragging her. "Keep your head up," he hissed in her ear. "Do not look at them." He wasn't protecting her feelings. He was protecting his investment. They reached the steps of the hotel. Elias had followed at a distance, making sure she arrived safely. He stopped at the edge of the muddy street, refusing to step onto the boardwalk. Lydia wrenched her arm free from Victor. She turned around. "Lydia, get inside." Victor snapped. "No, she said." She walked back to the edge of the boardwalk. She was shaking, but she stood tall. She looked down at Elias. "Thank you," she said. Her voice trembled, but she made sure it carried. "Thank you for my life." Elias looked up at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were soft. "You survived." "Lydia," he said, "you did that." Victor stepped up beside her, placing his body between her and Elias. "Yes, yes, thank you," Victor said, his voice dripping with ice. "Now, be on your way. You are blocking traffic." Elias looked at Victor for a long second. He looked at the hired guns who were watching him, hands hovering near their weapons. He understood the situation perfectly. He was a threat, not just because of what might have happened in the cabin, but because he was a man who owed nothing to the company. He nodded once to Lydia. Then he turned and walked away, his boots sinking into the muck, heading toward the edge of town where the trees began. Lydia watched him go until Victor grabbed her arm and pulled her through the doors of the hotel. The room Victor had arranged for her was the best in the boarding house. It had wallpaper with yellow flowers, a brass bed, and a washstand with a porcelain pitcher. It felt like a coffin. Lydia stood in front of the mirror. She had scrubbed the mountain dirt from her skin. Her hair was brushed until it shone. She was wearing a dress Victor had brought for her, a navy blue silk with high lace at the throat. She looked like Lydia Beaumont, the heiress, but the woman in the mirror felt like a stranger. She looked at her hands. They were clean, but the nails were broken, and there were calluses on her palms from the hatchet. She touched her face. It was windburned, rougher than it should be. She hated the dress. It was too tight. The corset felt like it was crushing her ribs. She couldn't breathe. She walked to the window. It looked out over the alleyway behind the hotel. The sun had set, and the town was dark, save for the gas lamps on the main street. She thought of the cabin. She thought of the firelight dancing on the logs. She thought of Elias whittling the wooden horse. She thought of the moment on the ladder when he had caught her, the heat of his chest, the terrified longing in his eyes. She looked at the clean, cold bed. "I am not this woman anymore," she whispered to the empty room. She couldn't stay here, not tonight. The pre-dawn light was gray and ghostly. The town was asleep, the saloons finally quiet, the miners not yet risen for the morning shift. Lydia slipped out the back door of the hotel. She had put her sturdy boots back on, hiding them under the hem of her silk dress. She wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders. She found him where she knew he would be. Elias had made camp in a small grove of aspen trees just outside the town limits. He hadn't paid for a room. He wouldn't sleep under a roof that wasn't his own. He was packing his mule. He didn't turn when she approached. He knew her step. "You shouldn't be here," he said, tightening a strap on the saddlebag. "I couldn't let you leave without saying a proper goodbye," Lydia said. She stepped into the clearing. The air was cold, mist hanging in the trees. Elias turned. He looked at her in the blue dress. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked uncomfortable, out of place in the valley, just as she felt out of place in the silk. "Victor will be looking for you," Elias said. "Let him look," Lydia said. They stood there, 3 feet apart. The distance felt like miles. There was so much they couldn't say. She couldn't say, "Take me with you." He couldn't say, "Stay." The world, Victor, her father, the town, the laws of society, stood between them like a wall of iron. "You'll be all right?" Elias asked. "You have money. You have position. I have a cage," Lydia said bitterly. Elias stepped closer. He reached out, as if to touch her, then stopped himself. His hand hovered in the air for a second before dropping to his side. "You are strong." "Lydia," he said fiercely, "I saw you carry that wood. I saw you walk through that snow. Do not let them make you weak again." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "I will try." Elias nodded. He put his hat back on, pulling the brim low. "I best be going," he said. "The pass will be soft by noon." He swung himself up onto his horse. He looked down at her one last time. His eyes memorized her face, the determined set of her jaw, the windburn on her cheeks. "Goodbye, Lydia. Goodbye." "Elias." He turned the horse and nudged it forward. The mule followed, plodding through the wet leaves. Lydia stood in the gray light, watching him go. She watched until the dark shape of his back disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by the forest. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. But it wasn't the cold. It was the feeling that the mountains were taking something precious from her a second time. First, they had taken her innocence. Now, they were taking the only man who had ever seen her for who she truly was. She turned back toward the ugly, sleeping town, her heart hardening in her chest like a stone. She would go back, she would play the part, but she would not forget. Spring arrived in the mountains, not with a gentle unfurling of flowers, but with a violent, muddy thaw. The snow that had choked Silver Creek for months turned to a slurry of gray slush, churning under the wheels of ore wagons and the boots of 3,000 men. For Lydia Beaumont, the weeks that followed her return were a performance. She moved through the rooms of the newly finished Grand Silver Hotel like an actress on a stage, reciting lines written by someone else. She wore the silks Victor purchased for her. She pinned her hair up with tortoiseshell combs. She smiled at the bankers and railroad men who came to dinner, nodding politely as they discussed tonnage and yields and the price of silver per ounce. But beneath the corsets and the lace, her skin felt too tight. She could not forget the silence. It was a physical weight, the absence of the wind in the spruce trees and the crackle of the stove in Elias's cabin. Sitting at a dinner table set with crystal and linen, listening to Victor boast about the new crushing mill. Lydia would suddenly smell wood smoke. She would feel the phantom weight of a water bucket in her hand, or the rough warmth of a buffalo coat. She would look at the manicured hands of the men around her, soft hands that held nothing heavier than a brandy snifter, and remember Elias's scarred, capable fingers mending a boot by lamplight. And with her memory came sight, before the accident. Lydia had looked at the mining town and seen only a rough, romantic backdrop for her own adventure. Now, she saw the truth. She saw the miners trudging home at dusk, their faces masked in coal dust, coughing with a wet, rattling sound that signaled the lung rot. She saw a man with 3 fingers missing on his left hand begging for coin outside the saloon, ignored by the very foreman who had likely ordered him into the shaft that maimed him. She saw the shanty town on the edge of the creek, where the Chinese laborers were forced to live. It was a cluster of tents and scrapwood shacks, constantly flooded by the runoff from the stamp mills. She saw children running barefoot in the freezing mud, their bellies distended, while their mothers scrubbed laundry in water that smelled of sulfur and arsenic. One afternoon, while walking back from the general store, she stopped to watch a funeral procession. It was a pine box, small enough for a child, being carried up the muddy hill to the graveyard. The mother walking behind it was not much older than Lydia, her face flayed by grief. Victor called this progress. He called it civilization. Lydia called it a graveyard with a payroll. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late April. Victor was holding a meeting in the private back room of the hotel, which he used as his office. He had told Lydia to wait in the parlor, as they were to dine with the territorial governor at 7. But Lydia was early. She walked down the hallway, the carpet muffling her footsteps. The door to the office was ajar, spilling a slice of yellow gaslight into the corridor. She heard Victor's voice, low and hard, followed by the oily chuckle of Sheriff Grady. "The deeds are a formality. Grady," Victor was saying, "possession is 9/10 of the law, especially up here. If they are not on the land, they cannot claim it." Lydia stopped. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart beating a sudden, frantic rhythm. There was a rustle of paper. "This is the survey map," said a third voice. "Mr. Pembroke, the company lawyer. A man with eyes like a lizard. The vein runs right through the upper basin, here where the North Ridge meets the Needle Rock." Lydia closed her eyes, visualizing the map in her head. The North Ridge, the Needle Rock. That is deep country. The sheriff said, "You have got a few squatters up there. Trappers. Some homesteaders who pushed up past the snow line." "Squatters," Victor corrected him. "They have no title, not one that will hold up in a court I pay for." Lydia heard the clink of glass on glass. "We need that water access for the hydraulic pumps." Victor continued, "I want the basin cleared by the 1st of June. Send your deputies up. Tell them the land has been claimed by the Hale Mining Company. Tell them to pack their mules and leave. And if they don't," Pembroke asked. Victor's voice turned cold. "Then we burn them out. Accidents happen in the high country. A overturned lamp, a lightning strike. If a few shacks burn down, well, it saves us the trouble of tearing them down." Lydia stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "What about the wild man?" the sheriff asked. "The one who brought your girl back, Kane. His cabin sits right at the choke point of the valley. He has been there 20 years. He is not the type to scare easy." Lydia stopped breathing. "Kane is a nuisance," Victor said, and the venom in his voice was palpable. "He is a relic, if he gives you trouble. Grady, you treat him like a wolf that's been killing livestock. You put him down." Lydia spun away from the door, her skirt swishing softly. She walked back to the lobby, her legs trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. She sat on a velvet settee, staring at a potted fern, her mind screaming. They were going to kill him. They were going to burn the valley. When Victor emerged 10 minutes later, smelling of cigars and self-satisfaction, he found Lydia pale and rigid. "You look unwell, my dear," he said, reaching for her hand. Lydia pulled her hand away. "I heard you," she said. Her voice was steady, though her insides were shaking. Victor paused, his smile fading slightly. "I beg your pardon. I heard you speaking with the sheriff. About the upper basin. About Elias Kane?" Victor sighed, an expression of exaggerated patience crossing his face. He gestured for her to lower her voice. "Lydia, business is a complicated affair. Sometimes hard decisions must be made to ensure the prosperity of the company, and by extension, your prosperity." "Prosperity?" Lydia hissed. "You are talking about arson. You are talking about murder. Those people have homes there. Elias has lived there for 20 years. He is a squatter," Victor snapped, his veneer of politeness cracking. "He sits on land that contains a fortune in silver. Do you expect me to let millions of dollars lie in the ground because a hermit wants to play king of the mountain?" "He saved my life," Lydia cried. "And I paid him for it," Victor shot back. "Or I tried to. He refused. That settles the debt." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You are letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Lydia, you have a romantic notion of that man because of your ordeal. But he is nothing. He is an obstacle. And I will not let you or him stand in the way of progress." He took her arm, his grip bruising. "Now, go upstairs and fix your face. The governor is expecting us, and I will not have you looking like a ghost." Lydia looked at him. She looked at the polished buttons of his vest, the cold deadness in his eyes, and for the first time, she did not see a fiancé. She saw a monster. "I will not go to dinner," she said. Victor stared at her. Then he released her arm with a shove. "Fine, stay in your room. Sulk if you must. But when I come back tonight, we are going to have a long conversation about your future. Lydia, and you are going to listen." He turned and walked out of the hotel. Lydia watched him go. Then she turned and ran for the stairs. But she did not go to her room. The moon was a sliver of bone in the night sky when Lydia rode out of Silver Creek. She was not wearing silk. She had borrowed, she corrected herself, a pair of boys' trousers and a rough wool shirt from the hotel laundry. She wore her sturdy boots and a heavy canvas coat she had bought from the stable hand with a gold earring she pulled from her lobe. The horse was a roan mare, sure-footed and strong. Lydia had paid the stablemaster triple her value to look the other way and forget he had seen her. She rode hard. The trail was treacherous in the dark, a ribbon of mud and ice winding up into the black timber. But Lydia did not feel the fear she had felt on the stagecoach months ago. She felt a cold, burning purpose. She knew the landmarks. The twisted pine that looked like a reaching hand, the rock face that wept water, the turn in the trail where the air suddenly got thin and sharp. She rode through the night, the temperature dropping until frost coated the mare's mane. Wolves howled in the distance, a sound that used to terrify her, but now sounded like a greeting. By dawn, she was in the high country. The valley opened up before her, bathed in the pale, rose-gold light of morning. It was exactly as she remembered it. The dark line of cliffs, the winding creek, the stand of spruce trees that sheltered the cabin. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Lydia kicked the tired mare into a trot. She splashed through the icy ford of the creek and rode into the clearing. Elias was there. He was chopping wood, the axe rising and falling with a rhythmic thwack. He stopped mid-swing as he heard the hoofbeats. He turned, the axe held across his chest, his body tensing for a fight. When he saw her, the axe dropped from his hands. He stood frozen, staring at the figure on the horse. Lydia slid down from the saddle. Her legs almost gave way. She had not ridden in months, but she caught herself on the stirrup. She was spattered with mud, her hair wild, her face pale with exhaustion. "Lydia?" Elias said. The name came out as a question, as if he was seeing a ghost. Lydia stumbled toward him. Elias caught her by the arms, steadying her. His grip was hard, real. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice rough with shock and a flash of anger. "You shouldn't be here. The pass is dangerous. Victor is coming," Lydia gasped, cutting him off. Elias went still. "What?" "He is coming for the valley. Elias, I heard him. He has found silver in the upper basin. He is sending the sheriff and hired men. They have false deeds. They are going to drive everyone out." Elias let go of her arms. He stepped back, his face darkening. "Let them come," he growled. "I have held this cabin against winters and cougars. I can hold it against a lawyer." "No!" Lydia cried, grabbing his sleeve. "You don't understand. They aren't just coming with papers. Victor gave the order to burn you out." He called it accidents. He told the sheriff to kill you if you resisted. Elias looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, and the exhaustion. He saw that she had ridden through the night, risking the wolves and the cold, just to warn him. He looked around the clearing, at the cabin he had built with his own hands, at the valley that had been his sanctuary for 23 years. "Why did you come?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you stay safe in your hotel?" Lydia looked at him, her eyes fierce. "Because this is not just land. Elias, it is people. There are families in the lower basin, the Millers, the Swedish family by the ridge. Victor is going to burn them out too." She took a breath. "And because I could not let you die thinking that I was one of them?" Elias stared at her for a long moment. The hard shell of his solitude, which had begun to crack during the blizzard, shattered completely. He saw the woman she had become, no longer the fragile doll in the snow, but a creature of fire and grit. He turned and walked to the chopping block. He pulled his knife from his belt and drove it into the wood with a savage motion. "We have to warn them," he said. The next 2 days were a blur of riding. Lydia and Elias moved through the high country like Paul Revere in buckskins. They rode to the isolated cabins tucked into the folds of the mountains, places Lydia hadn't even known existed. She met the people Elias had protected with his silence for years. There was Mrs. Miller, a widow with hands like gnarled roots, who lived in a sod-roofed shack with 3 children. When Lydia told her what was coming, the woman didn't cry. She just went to the mantel and took down a heavy buffalo gun. There was the Anderson family, Swedish immigrants who spoke little English but understood the word fire. Lydia watched as Mr. Anderson looked at his pregnant wife, his face tightening with fear and rage. At each stop, Elias was the rock. He spoke the language of the mountains. He told them where to hide their livestock, where to fall back if the riders came, how to defend their claims. But Lydia was the voice. She was the one who explained the legal trickery, the one who convinced them that this was real, that a man in a suit could be more dangerous than a bear. She saw the stakes in the eyes of the children who hid behind their mothers' skirts. She saw the meager gardens, the carefully stacked wood piles, the hard-won lives that Victor dismissed as squatting. It fueled a fire in her that burned hotter than any anger she had ever known. By the second night, they were back at Elias's cabin. They were exhausted, smelling of horse sweat and cold rain. The wind had picked up again, moaning around the eaves. It was a familiar sound now, almost comforting. Elias lit the lamp. The cabin was exactly as she had left it, yet it felt different. It felt smaller. The air was charged with a static electricity that snapped every time they moved near each other. "We have done what we can," Elias said, unrolling a map on the table. It was a hand-drawn chart of the valley, worn at the creases. "The families know. They will be ready." Lydia stood beside him, leaning over the table to look at the map. Her shoulder brushed against his arm. He did not pull away. "If they come up the south trail," Lydia said, tracing a line with her finger, "they will have to pass through the gorge. That is a choke point." Elias nodded. His voice was low, rumbling in his chest. "A few men could hold off 20 there." Lydia looked at his hand resting on the map. It was scarred, broad, and strong. She remembered how it had felt pulling her back from the cliff edge. She remembered how it had felt carrying her through the snow. She looked up. Elias was watching her. The map was forgotten. The wind outside faded into the background. There was only the heat of the stove and the heat of his body inches from hers. "You came back," Elias said softly. "I had to," Lydia whispered. Elias turned to face her. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the silver in his beard and the depth of his eyes. "I tried to let you go," he said. "I watched you ride away, and told myself it was right, that you belonged in the world of silk and lights." He took a step closer. "But the silence, it was too loud. Lydia, after you left, the silence was unbearable." Lydia's breath hitched. She reached out, her hand hovering over his chest. "I sat in those parlors," she said, her voice shaking, "and I felt like I was drowning. I missed the smell of pine. I missed the work. I missed you." She laid her hand on his chest. Through the rough flannel shirt, she could feel his heart hammering. It was beating as fast as hers. Elias closed his eyes for a second, a shudder running through him at her touch. Then he opened them, and the raw hunger she saw there made her knees weak. He reached up and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "Lydia," he breathed. He leaned in. Lydia tilted her head back. She wanted this. She wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. She wanted to erase the memory of Victor's cold, possessive grip. She wanted to be held by a man who knew the darkness and still chose the light. Their lips were inches apart. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and scent of coffee. She closed her eyes, leaning into him, surrendering. Then Elias stiffened. A groan tore from his throat, a sound of physical pain. He gripped her shoulders and pushed her back, not roughly, but firmly. "No!" he rasped. Lydia opened her eyes, dazed. "Elias?" Elias turned away, walking to the hearth. He gripped the stone mantel, his knuckles white. Staring into the fire, "I cannot," he said. His voice was tight, strained. "Why?" Lydia asked, stepping toward him. "Elias, we are both here. We are both. I am a man with nothing," Elias shouted, spinning around. The violence of his voice stopped her cold. "I have a cabin and a mule and a past full of graves," he said, his chest heaving. "I have enemies coming to burn my home. I cannot offer you a future. Lydia, I cannot ask you to trade a life of comfort for this." He gestured around the rough cabin. "And I will not be the man who steals you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I will not be the thief Victor thinks I am. If I touch you now, if I take this, I am confirming every lie they tell about me." He looked at her, and his eyes were wet. "I want you. Lydia, God help me. I want you more than I want to breathe. But I will not ruin you." Lydia stood in the center of the room. Her heart was breaking, but she saw the iron code he lived by. He was protecting her. Even now, he was placing her honor above his own desire. She straightened her spine. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "You could never ruin me." "Elias," she said softly, "you are the only thing that has ever made me whole." Elias closed his eyes. Pain etched into every line of his face. "Go to sleep, Lydia," he whispered. "We have a fight coming in the morning." He turned back to the fire, wrapping himself in his solitude like a cloak. Lydia climbed into the bunk, pulling the furs up to her chin. She listened to the wind, and to the sound of the man she loved breathing in the darkness, just out of reach. The dawn light bled over the eastern peaks like a fresh bruise, purple and tender against the gray stone. High on the ridge overlooking the upper basin, the air was still frozen, holding the sharp, suspended silence of the high country. Elias Kane lay on his stomach in the snow, his brass telescope pressed to his eye. Beside him, Lydia Beaumont shivered, though not entirely from the cold. She pulled the collar of the heavy canvas coat tighter around her neck, watching the valley floor below where the shadows were beginning to retreat. "They are early," Elias murmured. His voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the air. Lydia squinted. Far below, emerging from the dark line of the timber, a group of riders moved across the white expanse of the meadow. There were 6 of them. They did not ride like men who lived in the saddle. They rode with the heavy, arrogant posture of men who were paid to intimidate. "Who are they?" Lydia asked. "Hired guns," Elias said, collapsing the telescope with a sharp click. "And a few of the roughs from the saloon, Victor's cleanup crew." He pointed a gloved finger. "They are heading for the Miller homestead." Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Miller was alone with her children. Her husband had died in a shaft collapse 2 years ago. "We have to stop them," Lydia said, scrambling to her feet. Elias was already moving. He swung himself onto his mule, his movements fluid despite the stiffness of the cold. He checked the load in his rifle, the metallic clack-clack of the lever action sounding terrifyingly loud in the quiet morning. "Stay here," Elias commanded, looking down at her. "Keep the high ground. If shooting starts, you ride for the trees." "I'm coming with you," Lydia insisted, reaching for the reins of her borrowed mare. "No," Elias said. His eyes were hard, the eyes of the man who had survived 23 years of solitude. "You are the witness. Lydia, if I die down there, someone has to tell the truth." He did not wait for her argument. He kicked the mule into a run, the animal sliding and scrambling down the shale slope, a landslide of noise and fury descending upon the valley floor. The riders had surrounded the small sod cabin. One of them, a man with a scarred lip and a long duster coat, was pounding on the wooden door with the butt of a shotgun. "Open up," he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "By order of the Hale Mining Company, this land is under survey." The door remained shut. Inside, Lydia knew Mrs. Miller was likely crouching with her buffalo gun. Her children huddled behind the stove. The man laughed and turned to his companions. "Burn the roof," he said casually. "Smoke them out like badgers." A rider struck a lucifer match on his saddle horn and moved to toss it onto the dry thatch of the sod roof. A gunshot cracked through the air. The match flew from the rider's hand, spinning away into the snow. The horse reared, screaming, and the men scattered, pulling their weapons. Elias Kane sat on his mule 50 yards away, his rifle smoking slightly, the barrel resting easy across his saddle. He looked like a piece of the mountain that had torn loose, dark, immovable, and dangerous. "That is a warning," Elias called out. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the weight of absolute authority. "The next one takes a ear. The one after that takes a head." The leader with the scarred lip steadied his horse, squinting at Elias. "You are Kane," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "We heard about you, the hermit who thinks he owns the mountain." "I own nothing," Elias said calmly, "but these people are under my protection. Turn your horses." The leader sneered. "We have got papers. Old man, this land belongs to Mr. Hale. We are just conducting an inspection." "Inspect the road back to town," Elias said. The leader looked at Elias, then at the rifle. He looked at the 5 men behind him, all armed. But he also saw the look in Elias's eyes. It was a look that promised violence without hesitation. It was the look of a wolf that had backed into a corner and decided it liked the odds. The leader smiled. A slow, ugly expression. "All right," he said. "We are going, for now. But you can't watch every cabin, Kane, and you can't stop progress." He whistled to his men. They turned their horses, casting dark looks at the cabin and the solitary figure guarding it. As they rode past him, the leader leaned over his saddle. "Watch your back, mountain man. Accidents happen." Elias did not flinch. He watched them ride until they disappeared into the tree line. Only then did he lower the rifle, his shoulders sagging slightly with the release of tension. From the ridge, Lydia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She watched as the door of the cabin cracked open and Mrs. Miller stepped out, clutching her children, looking at Elias as if he were an avenging angel sent from God. But Lydia knew better. He was just a man, and there were only one of him. The retaliation did not come in the valley. It came where they least expected it. 2 nights later, the wind shifted, blowing hard from the north. Lydia was in her room at the boarding house, pacing the floor. She had returned to town to maintain appearances, to be the eyes and ears inside Victor's empire, while Elias remained in the high country to guard the pass. She heard the shouting first, then the frantic clanging of the fire bell. Lydia ran to the window. To the south, near the creek where the shantytown huddled, the sky was glowing a sickly, pulsating orange. Fire. She did not think of her reputation. She did not think of her dress. She grabbed her heavy shawl and ran out of the room, down the stairs, and into the street. The scene that greeted her was a vision of hell. The row of miners' shacks, flimsy structures of scrap wood and canvas, was engulfed. The fire leaped from roof to roof with terrifying speed, fed by the wind and the dryness of the timber. Men were running with buckets, forming chaotic lines to the creek. Women were screaming, dragging trunks and mattresses into the muddy street. The heat was physical, a wall that pushed against the skin. Lydia didn't stop. She ran toward the line, grabbing a bucket from an exhausted man. "Pass it," she screamed. For hours, she worked. Her silk dress was soaked with filthy creek water and mud. Her hands were blistered. She passed bucket after bucket, her shoulders screaming in agony, coughing as the thick, black smoke filled her lungs. She saw faces she recognized, miners she had seen in the street, now soot-streaked and desperate. She saw the Chinese laborers working side by side with the Irish and the Cornish, all differences forgotten in the face of the beast that consumed their homes. But the water was not enough. The fire burned until there was nothing left to consume. As the flames died down to smoldering embers, a wail rose up from the darkness. It was a sound so raw, so full of anguish, that it cut through the noise of the crowd. Lydia stumbled toward the sound. A woman was sitting in the mud, rocking back and forth. In her arms, she held a small bundle wrapped in a charred blanket. Lydia fell to her knees beside her. "Let me help," she rasped. "Let me—" The woman looked up, Her face was a mask of soot and tears. She pulled the blanket back. It was the boy. The boy with the bright red hair who worked as a runner at the mine. The boy who had once held the door open for Lydia and shyly touched the brim of his cap. He was gone. His small body was limp, his skin blackened by the smoke. Lydia stared at him. The world seemed to stop. The noise of the town faded into a dull roar. This was not an accident. She knew it in her bones. She remembered Victor's words in the office. If a few shacks burn down, it saves us the trouble of tearing them down. He had done this, to clear the land for a new storage yard. To make a point, he had burned a child to death for a line item on a ledger. Something inside Lydia broke. It was the last fragile tether that bound her to the world of polite society, to the rules of her father and her class. It snapped with a violence that left her cold and hard. She stood up. She looked at the weeping mother, then at the smoking ruins. She wiped the soot from her face, but she did not wipe away the rage. "I swear to you," she whispered to the dead boy, "he will answer for this." News of the fire reached the high country by noon the next day. A trapper passing through saw the smoke and rode up to tell Elias. "Miners' Row is gone," the man said. 7 dead, a kid among them. They say it started in 3 places at once. Elias did not speak. He saddled his horse. He packed his saddlebags with ammunition. He tied his knife to his thigh. He did not ride with the caution of a scout this time. He rode with the fury of a storm. When he reached Silver Creek, he did not go to the hotel. He rode straight to the company office, a 2-story brick building that stood untouched and pristine above the blackened ruins of the shanty town. He kicked the door open. Victor Hale was not there. Instead, Sheriff Grady sat behind the desk, his feet up, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. 5 deputies stood around the room, shotguns in their hands. It was a trap. "Ah, the mountain man," Grady said, smiling lazily. "We were wondering when you would come down." "Where is he?" Elias growled, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Where's the butcher?" "Mr. Hale is indisposed," Grady said, standing up. "But he left instructions. You see, we found the arsonist. The deputies raised their shotguns." Elias's eyes darted around the room. He could draw. He could drop 3 of them before they fired. But he would die, and Victor would win. "You are the arsonist." "Kane," Grady said, picking up a piece of paper from the desk. "We have witnesses who saw you near the creek last night with a torch. Stirring up trouble, inciting violence against the company, it is a lie," Elias said. "Does it matter?" Grady smirked. The deputies surged forward. Elias reacted on instinct. He grabbed the barrel of the nearest shotgun, twisting it from the deputy's hands and driving the butt into the man's stomach. He spun, landing a heavy fist on another man's jaw. The room exploded into chaos. It was a brawl of desperate violence. Elias fought like a cornered bear, throwing men across the room, shattering furniture, but there were too many of them. A pistol butt slammed into the back of his head. Lights exploded behind his eyes. He went down to one knee, groaning. "Hold him!" Grady shouted. "Don't kill him! We need a show!" Rough hands grabbed Elias's arms, pinning him to the floor. He struggled, but the strength was draining out of him. He looked up to see Grady standing over him, panting, a triumphant grin on his face. "Lock him up," Grady ordered. "We will let the town decide what to do with a child killer." The jail was a stone box beneath the sheriff's office. It was damp, smelling of mold and urine. There was no window, only a small barred grate in the heavy iron door. Elias sat on the cold floor, his hands bound in heavy iron cuffs. His head throbbed where he had been struck. Outside, he could hear the town. "Hang him," someone shouted. "Burn the savage." Victor had done his work well. He had twisted the town's grief into rage and pointed it at the easiest target, the outsider, the wild man. Elias leaned his head against the stone wall. The old shame, the one he had carried for 23 years, washed over him. "I am a curse," he thought. "Everyone I touch suffers. Sarah, the baby. And now the town, now Lydia. He should have stayed on the mountain. He should have never let her into the cabin. He should have let the snow bury him years ago." A sound at the door made him look up. The heavy bolt slid back. The door creaked open. Lydia stood there. She was wearing a dark cloak, the hood pulled up. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red from the smoke and the tears. She stepped inside, and the deputy locked the door behind her. 5 minutes. Miss. The deputy grunted through the grate. Lydia rushed to the bars of the inner cell. Elias. She reached through, her fingers brushing his face, touching the bruise on his temple. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. "I am fine," Elias said, pulling back slightly. "Lydia, you shouldn't be here. They will think you are part of this. I am part of this," she said fiercely. Her hands gripped the cold iron bars until her knuckles were white. "They are saying you set the fire," she said. "Victor is telling everyone that you did it to hurt the company, that you are a madman." "You know I didn't," Elias said. "I know," she said, "and I know who did." She looked around to make sure they were alone, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I am going to get you out." "No," Elias said firmly. "You cannot fight them. Lydia, Victor owns the law here. He owns the judge. He owns the truth. You have to go back east. Save yourself." "I am done saving myself," Lydia hissed. The anger in her voice surprised him. "I saw that boy die. Elias, I held his mother while she screamed. I am not leaving. I am not going back to Philadelphia to sip tea and pretend the world isn't burning." She looked him in the eye, and he saw a steel in her that matched his own. "I am not let them hang an innocent man to protect a guilty one. Not while I have breath in my body." "What are you going to do?" Elias asked, fear for her clutching at his heart. "I am going to use the one thing Victor thinks I am good for," she said grimly. "I am going to be a quiet, invisible woman, and I am going to ruin him." She squeezed his hand one last time, then turned and banged on the door. "Deputy, I am finished." Elias watched her go, a flicker of hope warring with the dread in his gut. Midnight. The town was restless, fueled by whiskey and anger, but the company building was quiet. Lydia knew the schedule. The watchman, an old man named Hensley, made his rounds every hour on the hour. He spent the rest of the time dozing by the stove in the lobby. Lydia slipped through the service entrance in the alley. She had stolen the key from Victor's coat pocket 2 days ago, a small act of rebellion she hadn't known how to use until now. She moved through the darkened hallways like a shadow. She wore soft-soled slippers so her footsteps made no sound. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her throat, a frantic, bird-like flutter. She reached Victor's office. It was locked. She pulled a hairpin from her bun. Elias had taught her how to pick a simple lock during the long winter nights in the cabin. "It's all about tension," he had said. "Feel the pin catch." Her hands were shaking. She forced herself to breathe. 1, 2, click. She turned the handle and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She went straight to the heavy oak desk. She didn't light a lamp. The moonlight filtering through the window was enough. She opened the bottom drawer. Locked. She picked it. Inside were ledgers. Not the ones Victor showed the investors. These were the real ones. The black ledgers. She opened one, squinting in the dim light. There it was. April 12th. Payment to Sheriff Grady, $500. Services rendered. April 14th. Purchase of kerosene, 20 gallons. April 15th. Bonus to cleanup crew. Incident at Shantytown. Her finger traced the lines. It was all there. The bribery, the arson, the blood money. She found a stack of letters bound in twine. She untied them. They were orders to the mine foreman. If the squatters refused to vacate, ensure their removal by any means necessary. No witnesses. And then the smoking gun. A deed transfer for the Upper Basin, dated 3 months ago, before the survey was even completed. It was signed with a forgery of Mrs. Miller's name. Lydia stuffed the papers into her cloak. She had enough. She had the noose to hang Victor Hale. She turned to leave. The doorknob turned. Lydia froze. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She looked for a place to hide. The heavy velvet curtains. She dove behind them just as the door opened. Victor walked in. He was holding a lamp. Lydia held her breath, pressing herself against the cold glass of the window. She could see him through the crack in the curtains. He looked agitated. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. He walked to the desk. He paused. He looked at the bottom drawer. Lydia had closed it, but had she locked it? Victor tugged on the handle. It opened. He swore softly. Someone has been here. He spun around, holding the lamp high. Who is there? Come out. Lydia's hand found a heavy brass vase on the windowsill. If he opened the curtain, she would strike him. She would fight. Victor took a step toward the curtains. Suddenly, a shout came from the hallway. "Mr. Hale! Mr. Hale!" Victor stopped. "What is it?" The watchman burst in. "The crowd! Sir! They are marching on the jail! They want to drag Kane out tonight." Victor smiled. A cruel, satisfied expression. "Excellent," he said. "Let them have their fun." He turned and followed the watchman out, leaving the drawer open, leaving the room empty. Lydia sagged against the wall, tears of relief stinging her eyes. She waited 10 seconds, then bolted. The next morning, the town square was a sea of angry faces. Victor had called a town gathering on the steps of the courthouse. It was a kangaroo court disguised as justice. A gallows had been hastily erected in the mud. Elias stood on the platform, his hands bound behind his back, a rope around his neck. He looked battered, his face bruised, but he stood tall. He looked out at the crowd with a calm, stoic resignation. Victor stood next to him, raising his hands for silence. "Citizens of Silver Creek," he bellowed, "justice must be swift. This man came down from his mountain to destroy our homes, to kill our children. Yeah, hang him!" The crowd roared. "He is a savage," Victor shouted, "a relic of a brutal past. We cannot build a future with men like this among us. Pull the lever," a miner shouted. Victor nodded to the executioner. "Stop!" The voice was high and clear, cutting through the mob like a bell. Lydia Beaumont climbed onto the platform. She looked small next to the gallows, but she moved with a fury that made men step back. "Lydia!" Victor hissed, stepping toward her. "Get down from here. You are hysterical." She ignored him. She turned to the crowd. She held up the bundle of papers in her hand. They fluttered in the wind. "He didn't do it!" she shouted. Elias Kane did not set that fire. The crowd muttered. Confused, Victor grabbed her arm. "That is enough. Take her away." Lydia wrenched her arm free. She turned and slapped Victor across the face. The sound cracked like a whip. The crowd went silent. Lydia held up the ledger. "I have the proof," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I have the ledgers from Victor Hale's own desk." She opened the book, her hands shaking, but her voice gaining strength. April 15th. Payment for kerosene used to burn the shacks. Signed by Victor Hale. She pulled out a letter. "Order to Sheriff Grady. Make sure there are no witnesses." She pointed a trembling finger at the sheriff, who was standing by the lever. "He was paid $500 to look the other way while your homes burned. While that boy died." The crowd shifted. The anger that had been directed at Elias began to turn, swirling in confused eddies. Men looked at the sheriff. They looked at Victor. "She is lying," Victor shouted, though his face had gone pale. "She is sick. The mountain man turned her mind." "Read it," Lydia challenged, throwing the papers into the crowd. "Read it yourselves." A miner in the front row picked up a fallen letter. He read it, his lips moving silently. He looked up, his face hardening. "It says it right here," he growled. "Remove by any means necessary." A murmur went through the crowd. It grew louder, turning into a rumble. "You killed my boy?" The voice of the grieving mother rose from the back. Victor took a step back. He looked at the crowd, then at Lydia. His eyes were no longer the eyes of a fiancé. They were the eyes of a snake. "You stupid little fool," he whispered to her, low enough that only she and Elias could hear. "You have destroyed everything. I have saved my soul," Lydia whispered back. Victor looked at Elias. He looked at the rope. He smiled. A thin, terrifying smile. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "arrest this woman for theft and hang the prisoner, now." The sheriff reached for the lever. The crowd surged forward. "No!" Lydia screamed, throwing herself in front of Elias, but the sheriff's hand was already moving. In the chaos, Victor locked eyes with Lydia. It was a promise. "I will make you pay for this." The roar of the crowd rose to a deafening crescendo as the platform shook under their feet. The telegraph wires singing in the wind above Silver Creek carried more than just prices of ore and requests for supplies. They carried the scandal of the century, the story of the railroad heiress, the mountain man, and the burning of the shanty town raced down the line to Denver and beyond, setting the territory alight. 3 days after Lydia stopped the hanging, the outside world arrived. It came in the form of a special train, puffing heavy black smoke against the pristine blue of the sky. From the first carriage stepped Judge Thaddeus Moore, a circuit judge with a face like a dried walnut and a reputation for hanging cattle thieves before breakfast. Behind him came Mr. Sterling, a newspaperman from Denver with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. And finally, descending the iron steps with the stiffness of a man walking to his own execution, came Silas Beaumont. Lydia watched from the window of the boarding house. She saw her father pause on the platform, his gaze sweeping over the muddy, chaotic town with a mixture of revulsion and fear. He looked older than she remembered. The formidable titan of industry seemed shrunken beneath the vast, indifferent sky of the Rockies. The air in town was thick, charged with a static tension that raised the hair on one's arms. It felt like the heavy, breathless moment before a summer storm breaks over the divide. The miners were not working. They stood in clusters on the street corners, eyeing the company men with open hostility. The sheriff's deputies walked in pairs, hands hovering near their holsters. The hearing was convened in the town hall, a drafty wooden building that smelled of wet wool, sawdust, and the nervous sweat of 200 people crammed into a space meant for 50. Judge Moore sat behind a scarred oak table, his gavel resting on a block of wood. "This court is in session?" he boomed. "We are here to examine the charges of fraud, arson, and attempted murder brought against the Hale Mining Company, and the countercharges of theft and sedition brought against Miss Lydia Beaumont and Mr. Elias Kane." Lydia sat at a small table, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the navy silk dress, cleaned and pressed, but she wore it differently now. It was no longer a costume of her station. It was armor. Victor sat across the aisle, flanked by Mr. Pembroke and Sheriff Grady. Victor looked calm, polished, and utterly reasonable. He nodded to the judge, playing the part of the aggrieved businessman to perfection. Elias was brought in last. He was shackled, escorted by 2 deputies. He walked with a slight limp from the beating he had taken in the jail, but his head was high. He wore his buckskins, dark with grease and age, standing out against the sea of black suits and white shirts like a rough-hewn pine in a formal garden. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Lydia. Lydia stood up. She walked to the bench, clutching the bundle of stolen papers. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. "These documents were taken from the private desk of Victor Hale. They detail a conspiracy to defraud the government, to steal land from lawful settlers, and to silence anyone who stood in the way." She read the entries. She read the order to burn the shacks. She read the forged deeds. Mr. Pembroke, Victor's lawyer, stood up. He was a slick man with a voice like oil poured over gravel. "Objection, Your Honor," Pembroke said, smiling pityingly at Lydia. "These documents are unverified scrawls." "And the witness?" "A hysterical young woman who has suffered a severe trauma." He turned to the crowd, gesturing at Lydia. "We must remember," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that this poor girl was lost in the wilderness for a week, alone, with that man." He pointed a finger at Elias. "Can we truly trust the word of a woman who has been influenced by such a savage? A man who lives like a beast, a man who likely twisted her mind to save his own neck." The implication hung in the hot air of the room. He was not just attacking her credibility, he was attacking her virtue. He was painting Elias not as a savior, but as a corrupter. Elias stood in the dock, listening. He felt the old shame rising, the familiar belief that he was poison. I should have died in the snow, he thought. I am dragging her down with me. But then Lydia spoke. She did not look down. She did not blush. She turned and looked Mr. Pembroke in the eye. That man, she said, her voice ringing clear and hard, is the only honorable man in this room. The crowd went silent. He did not twist my mind. Lydia continued. He saved my life. When I was freezing, he carried me. When I was hungry, he fed me. And when I saw the cruelty of this town, the way you treat the miners, the way you burn children in their beds, he showed me that there is a law higher than money. She looked at Elias. He is not a savage, she said, her voice shaking with a fierce, terrified pride. He is a man who knows the cost of life, and I would rather stand with him in the mud than with any of you in your fine suits. Elias felt something inside him break. It was not a breaking of bone or spirit, but the shattering of the iron bands that had constricted his heart for 23 years. She had not just defended him, she had claimed him. She had looked at the scars and the silence and called them honorable. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like a curse. Victor Hale watched the exchange, and his eyes narrowed. He looked at the judge, who was leaning forward, studying the ledgers with a frown. He looked at the newspaperman, who was scribbling furiously in his notebook. He looked at Silas Beaumont, who was staring at Victor with the dawn of a terrible realization. Victor knew, with the instinct of a gambler, that the hand was lost. He leaned over to Pembroke. "Keep them talking," he whispered. He stood up, buttoning his coat. "I must get some air," he said to the deputy. "The heat is unbearable." The deputy, still on the company payroll, nodded and let him pass. Lydia stepped out onto the porch of the town hall 10 minutes later. The judge had called a recess to examine the documents in his chambers. Her head was spinning, the adrenaline of her testimony beginning to fade into exhaustion. She took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. The sky had darkened. Heavy gray clouds were rolling over the peaks. The smell of rain and ozone was thick. She looked toward the livery stable down the street. She saw a flash of a familiar coat, the fur collar. Victor. He was not getting air. He was moving quickly, carrying a heavy leather saddlebag, heading for the rear entrance of the stables. Lydia's mind raced. The ledgers mentioned a strongbox, cash reserves kept for bribes and emergencies. If he left now, he would disappear into the territories. He would escape justice. She did not think. She picked up her skirts and ran. She reached the open doors of the livery just as Victor was tightening the cinch on his black stallion. The barn was dark, smelling of hay and horse sweat. "Going somewhere?" "Victor?" she asked, her voice breathless. Victor spun around. His face was a mask of fury. "You!" he snarled. He abandoned the horse and stalked toward her. "You ruinous little witch! You have destroyed everything I built." "He was going to prison," Lydia said, backing up. "You cannot run. Victor!" "The judge has the papers." Victor laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Papers? I have $50,000 in gold in these bags. Lydia, I can buy a new name. I can buy a new life in Mexico." He lunged at her. Lydia tried to turn and run, but he was too fast. His hand clamped around her wrist, spinning her around. He dragged her deeper into the barn, away from the street. "If I can't have the land," he hissed, pulling her against him, his breath hot and smelling of whiskey. "And if I can't have the company, then I will take the one thing I was promised." He shoved her back against a stall door. Lydia screamed, a sharp, high cry of terror that echoed off the rafters. Victor slapped a hand over her mouth, pinning her against the wood. "Be quiet," he snarled. "You belong to me, 2 blocks away." Elias was being led back to the jail by a single deputy. The crowds had thinned, people moving to the saloons to debate the hearing. Then he heard it. It was faint, muffled by the distance and the wind, but he heard it. He knew that voice. He had heard it scream in the blizzard. He had heard it whisper in the dark. Lydia. The sound triggered a reaction that bypassed thought. It was pure, animal instinct. Elias stopped. The deputy. A young man named Miller, who had been dozing during the hearing, yanked on the chain. "Keep moving. Kane." Elias turned. He looked at the deputy. "I am sorry." Elias grunted. He drove his shoulder into the deputy's chest. It was a blow like a battering ram. The young man flew backward, landing hard in the mud. The wind knocked out of him. The chain jerked from his hand. Elias ran. He ran with a speed that defied his size. He ran despite the ache in his ribs and the stiffness in his knees. He ran toward the scream. He burst into the livery stable just as the first drops of rain began to hammer on the tin roof. The barn was a cavern of shadows. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the slats. "Get off her," Elias roared. Victor looked up from where he had Lydia pinned. He saw the mountain man charging down the center aisle, a terrifying figure of vengeance. Victor shoved Lydia aside. She fell into the straw, scrambling away toward the tack room. Victor reached for the shovel leaning against a post. He swung it just as Elias closed the distance. The metal blade cracked against Elias's forearm, which he raised to protect his head. Pain exploded in his bone, but Elias didn't stop. He barreled into Victor, tackling him into an empty stall. They crashed into the wooden partition, splintering the boards. The horses in the neighboring stalls screamed and kicked, their iron shoes ringing against the wood. It was a brutal, ugly fight. There was no technique. It was a fight for survival. Victor clawed at Elias's face, gouging at his eyes. Elias punched Victor in the ribs, the sound of cracking bone audible over the rain. They rolled in the straw. Victor managed to get a knee up, driving it into Elias's stomach. Elias grunted, doubling over. Victor scrambled back. He reached into his coat. "Gun!" Lydia screamed from the darkness. Victor pulled a pearl-handled revolver. He raised it, his hands shaking, his face a mask of blood and hatred. "Die, you savage!" Elias lunged. He didn't try to dodge. He threw himself forward, grabbing Victor's wrist. The gun went off. The boom was deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash illuminated the barn for a split second in stark, white relief. Lydia cowering by the saddles, Elias gripping Victor's arm, the horses rearing. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Both men stood frozen, locked together. Then, Victor's eyes went wide. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stumbled back. A red stain began to spread across the white of his shirt, just below his heart. The bullet, deflected in the struggle, had found its mark. He looked at Elias, then at the gun in his own hand, as if he couldn't understand how it had betrayed him. The gun slipped from his fingers. He collapsed, his legs folding under him. He hit the straw with a soft thud. He twitched once, and then lay still, his eyes staring up at the leaking roof where the rain wept through. Elias stood over him, heaving for breath. He clutched his left arm where the shovel had hit him. Blood was dripping from a cut on his forehead, blinding him. Lydia! She was there in an instant. She scrambled over the straw, falling to her knees beside him. "Elias, are you hit?" Elias looked down at himself. He checked his chest. "No holes. I am whole," he rasped. He looked at Victor. "He is dead." Lydia looked at the body of the man she was supposed to marry. She felt no grief. She felt only a cold, quiet release. The barn doors burst open. Sheriff Grady, or rather, the former sheriff, ran in, followed by the judge, the newspaperman, and Silas Beaumont. They stopped, staring at the scene. The dead man, the strongbox spilled open on the floor, revealing stacks of gold notes and falsified deeds. The mountain man and the heiress, clinging to each other in the bloodied straw. Judge Moore stepped forward. He looked at the gun near Victor's hand. He looked at the money. "It seems," the judge said, his voice grim, "that the defendant has delivered his own verdict. The aftermath was a cleansing." The rain that fell that night turned to sleet, scrubbing the town of Silver Creek clean. In the morning, Judge Moore nullified every claim Victor Hale had filed in the last year. He declared the upper basin to be public land, open to the settlers who had improved it. He ordered a federal inquiry into the mine's safety practices. Sheriff Grady was arrested for corruption and accessory to arson. Half of Victor's hired guns saddled their horses and slunk out of town under the cover of darkness. knowing their paycheck was dead in the livery stable. Silas Beaumont sat in the company office, going through the books. What he found made him physically ill. He realized that his fortune, the Beaumont legacy, had been built on a foundation of blood and theft. He looked at his daughter, who sat across from him, her arm in a sling from a sprain she'd gotten in the barn. He looked at the woman who had stared down a mob and slapped a tyrant. "We cannot keep this money," Silas said quietly. "No," Lydia said, "we cannot." Silas agreed to pay reparations to every family who had lost a home in the fire. He set up a trust for the widow of the miner whose son had died. He signed over the deed to the land in the Upper Basin to a collective trust, ensuring it could never be bought by a single company again. It was not enough to bring back the dead, but it was a start. A week later, the train whistle blew, a lonely sound echoing off the canyon walls. Steam hissed onto the platform. The porters were loading trunks, Silas Beaumont's trunks. Lydia stood on the platform. She was wearing a simple woolen dress she had bought at the general store. She held a small carpet bag. Silas stood by the steps of the private car. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Lydia," he said, "come home. The scandal will pass. We can go to Europe for a year. People forget." Lydia looked at the train. It represented safety. It represented hot baths, libraries, and a life where the hardest decision was which tea to serve. She looked past the train, to the end of the platform. Elias was waiting there. He had washed his buckskins. He held his battered hat in his hands. He did not step onto the platform. He stood on the earth, waiting. He did not call to her. He simply watched her, offering her the choice he had promised never to steal. Lydia looked back at her father. "I cannot go back. Father," she said gently, "the woman who lived in that house is gone. She died in the snow?" Silas looked at her. He saw the calluses on her hands. He saw the fine lines around her eyes from the sun and the wind. He saw a strength he had never put there. He looked at Elias, then back at his daughter. "It is a hard life, Lydia," he warned. "It is unforgiving. It is an honest life," Lydia replied. "And it is mine." Silas swallowed hard. He nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document and a roll of banknotes. He pressed them into her hand. "This is the deed to the cabin," he said, his voice thick, "and enough to buy seed and tools." He kissed her on the forehead, a stiff, awkward gesture, but one filled with a reluctant respect. "Write to me," he said. He turned and boarded the train. Lydia watched the train lurch forward. She watched it gather speed, the metal wheels grinding on the rails, carrying the old world away. She turned and walked down the platform. She stopped in front of Elias. "They missed the train," Elias said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I wasn't waiting for it," Lydia said. She took his hand. It was warm and rough. "Let's go home," she said. Autumn came to the high country like a king in gold armor. The aspens turned a brilliant, trembling yellow, and the air grew crisp and sweet. The valley had changed. Smoke rose from 6 chimneys now. The sound of hammers rang through the clear air as men repaired roofs and built barns. Children played by the creek, their laughter chasing away the ghosts of the winter. Elias's cabin was no longer a hermit's fortress. It had a new room added on the south side, built of fresh, blonde logs. There was a garden where Lydia grew potatoes and hardy kale. On the porch, a rocking chair sat beside the chopping block. Elias stood by the fence, watching his mule graze. He felt the wind on his face, but it no longer felt like a judgment. The door of the cabin opened. Lydia stepped out. She was wearing a heavy shawl against the evening chill. She walked to him, slipping her arm through his. She rested her head against his shoulder. "It's going to be a cold winter," Elias said, looking at the clouds gathering on the peaks. "Let it snow," Lydia said softly. "We have plenty of wood." Elias looked down at her. He thought of the locket in the box, the memory of Sarah and the baby. The pain was still there, a dull ache that would never fully heal. But it was no longer the only thing in his heart. He had 23 years of silence behind him, but looking at the woman beside him, and the lights of the neighbors in the valley below, He knew he had a lifetime of noise and warmth ahead. He covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said, "we have plenty of wood." And for the first time, as the sun dipped below the jagged spine of the Rockies, the mountains didn't look like a wall keeping him in. They looked like arms, holding them safe. Thank you, dear friends, for listening to this story of Lydia and Elias. It has been a journey through the snow and the fire, and I am grateful you walked the trail with me. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If this story touched your heart, I encourage you to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. Please share your thoughts and feelings about the story in English. I read every one. Until we meet again by the campfire, travel safe.